We are excited to welcome Chief Revering and Deputy Chief Brian Hubbard and City Manager Ann Norris tonight. So we are going to have a little mini town hall, which is our fourth installment of a community conversation around the Crystal Police Department and just building stronger community ties and getting to know our police department better. So We'll bring in Chief Revering right now. Maybe. Hey, Chief, how are you doing?
Hi, everyone. I'm good. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good to see you.
You too.
And we got Brian coming in. Hey, Brian.
Hi, everybody. I apologize for the blue visual here. I don't know exactly why that is. I used the camera earlier today, and this was not an issue. But
yeah. Oh, you didn't say that. That's funny.
All right. Well, it's your words that count.
I still think that you look spooky.
We're glad we can hear you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. The blue does make the gray in my hair really pop out, is the other thing I noticed.
I just think it's festive. I think it's festive for Halloween. I think we can just go with it. It'll be great.
Great.
It is October in a few hours.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. I'm just going to, Amanda, I'm going to drop you out real quick and welcome Ann, since we're limited to 4.
Yep.
Hey, Ann, welcome.
Hey, how's everybody?
Are you able to hear?
Whoops.
Very good. We can hear you. All right, I'm gonna bring Ann. We'll have you come back here shortly as we do some introductions. And
you can't hear me, can you?
In. We can hear you.
Okay, I can't hear you.
Okay. Feel free to use your computer audio as well if that helps. Otherwise, you're also able to use your phone instead of your computer with that link that I sent you. So it could be a good alternative to keep your AirPods, meanwhile still kind of participating. All right. So to start us off, we're just gonna make some introductions. I'll start. My name is Ryan Adams. I'm a Crystal resident, and I've been an admin and moderator for Crystal Residents for Change for the past few months here, and it's been an awesome community experience for me, getting to know my neighbors, but also getting to know local council members as well as our police department. And I'm excited to be here tonight and bring this forum forward. Amanda? She froze.
She did.
Okay.
Might be the weather.
Yeah, this storm hit us like just as we were starting. So I'm gonna have her do this. See if it brings her back. But Chief, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us about your background.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Stephanie Revering, Police Chief with the Crystal Police Department. Been here as Chief since October 2012, so I'm hitting my 8-year mark as Chief. Been with the city since 1997. Married with 2 stepboys and live in the city of Brooklyn Park, and have enjoyed my long tenure here at the Crystal Police Department.
Excellent. Thank you. Deputy Chief Hubbard?
Of course.
Oh, Alexa wants to talk.
Hi, everybody. My name again is Brian Hubbard, and I am honored to serve as the Deputy Chief here. I've been in that role just over 2 years. I spent 17 years working with the YMCA as a youth worker and summer camp director, and then an executive with them, and decided to make a career change and have been in law enforcement about 15 years, spending the first chunk of my career with the Edina Police Department. I live in New Hope. And the goal to come into this job was that I grew up in Crystal and live 3 blocks out of Crystal in New Hope, and this was a chance for me to come home and serve in my community. Married and 3 teenage kids, so sometimes days at home are harder than days at work could ever be.
I can only imagine, especially during these schooling from home times. Anne doesn't look like she's ready just yet, so we will come back, I think, to her. Let's check in with her and see. Hey, Ann, are you able to hear us? Nope, not yet. So it turns out Amanda lost power at her house, so she's going to hotspot back in. But you know, one of those curveballs we're getting with this thunderstorm. I thought we dodged because it was pretty sunny out, a half hour ago. All right, Ann might be able to come in now. Hey, Ann, are you able to hear us? No. Wouldn't be technology without some technology issues. So I think what we can do in the meantime, though, is get started on our agenda, which we have a lengthy amount of questions to kind of continue on. And for those that are not familiar, this is our fourth time getting to discuss community ideation and concerns in Crystal. And the Crystal Residents for Change group has came up with a series of questions over the course of these several weeks and months, and there's some that remain answered, but a lot of them have been answered and fed out to the group members, and folks have really felt as though they've been able to gain insights that they had not previously. Looks like Amanda might be available here.
I'm back.
Awesome. Welcome back, Amanda.
Sorry about that. It was seconds after you said, okay, we're going to get started, and the power browned out, and then the modem's got to restart. What a time to be alive.
Well, glad you can make it back. Yeah. So we just went through our introductions, and so if you want to just tell us more about yourself. And
sure. Well, outside of being a user of the internet in 2020, I am a Crystal resident since 2015. I'm from the Northwest Outer Tier suburbs, as well as my husband. We have a 4-year-old daughter who is beginning to be in an academic career here in Crystal. And I work for Target Corporate. I'm also actively a director for an opera company out of the Twin Cities, and just generally a person who wants to, and I'm 33. It's time for me to get engaged with my community. So definitely just trying to use the skills that I have to help create space for people to have these types of conversations, and definitely taking a lot of undue credit for just by being here, because Ryan has been the wonder organizer of many, many things. I'm the crazy mom with Mom Brain over here. So that's my story.
Well, you're a wonderful partner to have in all this.
So generous.
So it looks like we can introduce Ann, hopefully, here. Hey, Ann, are you able to hear us?
I can hear you. Hopefully you can hear me. Sorry, I don't know what the issue is. We jinxed those damn earbuds. Sorry about that. But it's good to be here. Thank you for your patience.
No, glad we could have you. So we've just completed our introductions, and I know all of us are familiar with one another, but those that are tuning in may not be as much. And you really have the opening question here. If you don't mind just starting us out. A lot of people in our community are unfamiliar with, the Charter B city and, the difference between a mayor and a city manager. And I admit myself, I was still unclear on some of those things when I first started, my outreach to you guys, and how to better, work with the city to share my thoughts and concerns, and mostly just gain answers and insights. And you've been an outstanding person to reach out to and to coordinate with. And, as I witness other community groups doing the same efforts I have, I don't see, they're having as close of a relationship and ability to communicate with their city manager. So I applaud you in your ability to work with us and arrange for these, opportunities to talk. And so I'm hoping that you can just help us in the community, further understand, a city manager's role, a charter-based city, and the benefits of having an experienced professional in this role.
Sure, I'll do my best. If you'll allow, this is probably a lot of 4th grade civics or whatever they call it now, but anyhow, the charter is essentially Crystal's constitution for how we operate. Under the legislature, under the statutes rather, cities can either be charter or statutory, and there are lots of varieties of both within those, and I'm not going to bore you, but in 1960, Crystal adopted a city charter that defined the form of government as a consul and a manager. The consul is responsible for all the policy and legislative decisions. The manager is responsible for all the administration, hiring staff, and implementing essentially the consul's directives and decisions and policies. The city charter is a very brief document. It gives very general authority. It talks about the form of government, what the consul's role is, what my role is, what the consul procedure is, how elections and wards are to be figured out. Authorizes special assessments and franchises, and that's and then obviously, of course, requires me to produce a budget every year, but the consul is the one who has to approve it and levy taxes. But it is very broad. It's not like probably what we're almost familiar with in the press is the Minneapolis Charter. Ours is a very boring vanilla document. It just defines the structure of the government and what my job is versus what the consul's job is. So does that help?
Yeah, I think that's a great insight into the role and the differences. And
Whoops.
I know we can hear you. From our group side, we've been sharing links to what a Charter B city is so that folks can explore it more on their own. But certainly the information's out there, and we'll continue to share how citizens can continue to engage the council as well as city manager on relative topics. So the next segment here is talking more about our past meetings. So Stephanie and Brian, opening up with some of the things that maybe you've learned through our past 3 meetings, from us or from these efforts. And so if you have any, key insights or things that you found that we took away that were extremely helpful, I think it's an opportunity to just kind of abbreviate some of the last 3 meetings, even though that's certainly hard to do when it's been 4 hours of content.
Yeah, so, what I've learned from these last 3 meetings that we've had is the desire from you, Ryan, and Amanda, and just the entire group of wanting to learn, right, what the police department does in Crystal, right, like because we've had those exchanges, right, that we are different than Minneapolis, and that because the Charter B city that Ann was just talking about. So I've learned from you that this is important to you to get to know your police department, which we appreciate because we want that. We want the questions. Brian and I have the philosophy that is what we're here to do. We got into this role, both of us, because we're here to serve, and that's what our roles are as police officers. And so that's the biggest thing that I've learned throughout these last 3 months. I've also learned that we as a police department need to do more education with what it is that we do. I think a lot of times, and I hope you don't take this this isn't a slam by any means, but we don't do a good job at telling people what it is that police officers do, right? A lot of people see law enforcement as enforcement of law, right? That's one segment of what police officers actually do. We have a ton of other duties and responsibilities that we do that I think the general public just doesn't know about. That's why I always implore people to join our Citizens Police Academy, to do ride-alongs when we're not in COVID. But I just am grateful that you guys are out there asking us these questions.
Awesome, thank you. And Brian, you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I'm in a few too many of these meetings to not, because I'm always leading them saying, could you please mute your mic because we don't want to hear your dog and your radio squawking. And so I just have gotten in that habit. I certainly would echo the chief's sentiments. I think these have been very good. For me, it's probably, like anything, whatever line of work you're in, if you're a finance person, if you're a procurement manager, if you're a librarian, you swim in a lane that is the lane that you swim in. And and sometimes you just take things for granted. And by that I mean you take what you know for granted. And so I think, you know, for me, the context of the questions, as the chief said, is a great reminder of, okay, here's some messages maybe that we have not done a great job of communicating, or we haven't done a great job of making sure people understand what it is that we do. So I think that's good. You know, the way that we move forward, as in terms of, you know, we talk about reform and change and stuff. The way we do that is from an informed standpoint, right? That you can't make statements about something you don't understand. And I think in this discussion, it's twofold. We need to understand what the community is thinking, what the community wants, and what they don't understand. And then we need to be able to listen and then we need to educate, and we need to listen, and it needs to happen both ways. And once those two things can happen, that's where I think then we understand where those shared expectations come together and how we need to move the needle when we find spots where that obviously is the case.
Yeah, it's much appreciated that you can be a good listener, and that's kind of brings up my key learnings from all of this is the surprising level of that listening that you guys have been doing, the ability to sit back, intake, but then also have an output that is empathetic and responsible. Where I look at the key learnings, I'm seeing that you're open to others' perspectives. You're open to we look at your philosophies. At the last meeting, you guys were really put yourselves in a vulnerable position to really talk about your foundations of belief and your foundation of policing. And you said, if you have something that you think would give us something to think about, bring it to me. And I think that said a lot about your character. That you're not just saying this is the way. You're saying this is what I know. If you know something differently, let's talk about it. And I think that's all that we can ask for from a leader of our community, be it our police chief, our city manager, our council. So to that, I applaud you, because we're not necessarily seeing that in all the areas of our city, and especially in our state and our country. So I think that's something that I hope that community members do get to see through this meeting, and through our opinions, in that take advantage of this open door policy that you have. Get to know you, let alone when things do hit the fan, which at times they do. Contact you, have a civil discussion. You guys have been extremely rational in your conduct, and while I have a privilege as a white male in our city, and there's those that are not with that privilege. I hope that they can contact our group, or as you've made it very known, contact you, and that you can continue to provide to our Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, the same type of rationale and balance and commitment that you have to the white leaders of this group. So, Amanda, do you have any key learnings from your time so far?
I just want echoing what Ryan just said. I've also, on fewer occasions, I've interacted in person with Chief Revering and Deputy Chief Hubbard. Been in their presence at a city council meeting recently, and I too definitely feel as though the tone is listening, and the tone is reciprocal listening, and that's obviously something that we have been striving for, while still asking a lot of sometimes very difficult questions. As citizens, we are getting all sorts of perspectives from various media sources at all times. We don't always have, in fact, probably rarely, the education of the benefit of just knowing the ins and outs of how the different levels of government, city government, interact with our police force, how the police force is legally required or permitted to interact with the public. So to that point, yes, absolutely, education on both sides seems to be the thing. And this particular, I guess, administration, would we call you guys an administration of the police department in Crystal, has demonstrated, at least in my opinion, that they're very interested in that reciprocal education. So I want to say to our audience right now that, in my opinion, this is a really good conversation to be having and to be listening to. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Awesome. So Amanda, I'll transition this back to you to ask our first question that our community came up with. But I think it's important to level set, with ourselves and with our viewers, that what we're doing here is we're trying to establish trust, that there's been a large trust gap in our society between police and community. And I think we're fortunate that, Crystal is mending what gap there is across many avenues. And this is just one. So I think that we'd be remiss not to, to name, the factor of the issue, which is trust. But again, we appreciate you willing to accept these questions, and we look forward to your answers here.
I don't want to waste too much time giving background, but I think that given the press around statements that were made in the presidential debate last night and the media response from personal accounts on Twitter and things like that regarding the dismissal and the condemnation of white supremacy and the president's inability to concretely do so, there's a lot of concern in the community broadly regarding a well-armed militia, as it were. And the last time that Crystal Residents for Change met with the police department, the shooting of Jacob Blake by an officer in Kenosha, Wisconsin had just occurred. Kenosha then became home to various persons and groups of men who came from across state lines, in some cases with assault rifles, who disobeyed a curfew to quote unquote protect property. There are numerous media instances where officers provided water, protection, verbal gratitude of these armed men despite the curfew. And Kyle Rittenhouse was one, and he went on to murder 2 people and hurt additional people. So the question is, would you and your department support armed citizens being out after such a curfew under the guise of protecting businesses? And if yes, what justifies their presence? And really, I mean, I think speak to that as well, the justification or the lack thereof of their presence and exemption from abiding by the same curfew. If no, what would prevent you to do, or what would you do to prevent these sorts of persons from staying out after the curfew and potentially causing harm?
So the answer is no, that we would not allow it. If there's a curfew in place in the city of Crystal, then there's a curfew in place for all, right? Not just certain people in the city, but for everyone. So we would do the best we can as to, inform the folks who are breaking the curfew, who are, if God forbid it ends up in some type of assault, obviously we'd be arresting folks. So I can't tell you enough that obviously in these times and what's going on in the world today, we are Crystal is a small community, right? We are 22,000 population, 5.5 square miles, but we're a first-ring suburb of Minneapolis. We're a very busy police department, and we're going to do the best we can with the resources we have to combat anything that has to do with assaultive behavior to our residents or to anyone who comes into our city, and that's what we'll do. And no, we're not going to we're not going to allow people to, if we have a curfew in place, to everyone, no matter who that is, be able to do that type of behavior in our city.
Sure. I guess as an individual, my question also, and I honestly don't know the answer here, or if there is a good one, or a concrete one rather, but when I think about the Kenosha incident, there's all sorts of muddy accounts of what happened simply because it was taking place during a protest where there were peaceful protesters out after curfew as well. And the police department was there monitoring the situation, attempting to enforce the curfew. And then you have the addition of these armed quote unquote militiamen finding their way into that situation. And that becomes ambiguous. That becomes more difficult to manage when you're trying to allow peaceful gathering. And then you also have someone who perhaps starts out as peaceful and by all accounts might be legally carrying. But in that situation, if you yourself, I suppose, were in that situation, if you yourself were out enforcing curfew, but with a peaceful protest, that balance being struck there, and you witnessed this happening, and there were suddenly people with weapons, how would you handle finding out who had them legally and who didn't, who was too young, who was from out of state, who was on some sort of agenda that might end up with people being hurt? What would be your role in that situation, both legally and I guess instinctually?
So Amanda, I'm actually glad you recognize the fact that these types of situations are ever changing and they are very chaotic at the time, right? And when you have something like this at the time and you're dealing with folks who have weapons, that's obviously very disconcerting to us as law enforcement, because we have to protect not only those residents, but ourselves, right? And so it's hard for me to give you a concrete answer to this because things change so rapidly in these types of situations. Obviously, at the time when we see guns being pulled out and threats to be made, we're not going to be able to figure out right there and then who is able to carry legally, who's able, right? I mean, we're
Right.
not, because we're not going to have that type of cooperation, right? And so we're going to have to deal with it at hand. And Brian can jump in here and tell you, how exactly these type of things happen, but it's never by the book, right? There's no right answer to this question, because every time we have something, you take even just this simple domestic assault call, unfortunately, that happens in our city often, not one domestic is the same, right? These types of situations are not the same. And so we have to handle things differently, put on our hats in a different way to figure out which situation, and it changes, like you said, right? It could go from peaceful and then within a second not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to and I think the chief said that really well, is, one of the things that I think the way you effectively engage with the protest is that you engage with the protest. And by that, I mean, if we knew that there was a protest that was happening here in the city, we would attempt to make contact with the organizers ahead of time. If we don't know about it ahead of time, the chief or I or one of our command staffs are going to make our way to the middle of that for the purpose of trying to identify who it is, because we want to ensure that the First Amendment right is able to be maintained. So if you ended up here at 42nd and Douglas and the group's gathering in the Olmstead's lot and the group is planning to walk to Becker Park, we want to know that, not because we're telling you can't walk to Becker Park, but what we'd like to do is to close Douglas down so that we don't have anybody getting hurt. And that's the intent of how you kind of manage. And I say that with the law enforcement hat on, a protest to help it be successful. Well, hopefully in that, we're saying our goal is, even if you're protesting against us, our goal is the same, and it's still to keep people safe. And so in interacting with that, now I'm hoping that the protest organizers have a sense of who is in the midst here. And if there are some concerns that are brought up about what's happening, we're going to try and do that. Frankly, if there's a counter protest group, my statement is going to be, my strategy is going to be the same. I want to get to those folks and say, what we want is you to be able to say whatever it is that you're wanting to say, and we want you to do it in a safe manner. We bring weapons into the mix, as the chief said. Now we're in a different arena, right? Because I'm going to say most, I'm guessing, but most of the folks who are there to protest. They're there to make a loud statement. They are not there to create harm. And we want to make sure that that happens. Well, the guns start flying. Now the only message that's out for anybody on any side is the guns were flying. And so, if we know there's weapons, we have to manage to that. But the goal would be that we've been able to connect enough ahead of time to see, yeah, this doesn't fit. Your group's trying to do this. What are these people doing here? And let's see if we can start working that out to talk with folks.
Sure. Thank you for those answers.
Yeah, we appreciate it. So kind of segues to, the next question that Amanda was talking about, militia members. Recently it became evident that there is a biker club in Crystal, based here, and they had a small bike rally, just the other weekend. It was brought to the attention that these folks have 3%ers insignia as part of their bike club. So, without going into a large background, 3%ers have different affiliations across the country. It's a decentralized organization, just like Black Lives Matter. But there are many folks that are using this brand of insignia that align with white supremacy groups and other known and identified gangs by law enforcement. So, knowing that this is in our town, and that I just have a question for you guys, which is, are you familiar with the 3%ers? Are you familiar with how, they would fight against you, the police, if it comes to a point where they feel the government is being tyrannical? And I want to preface that with saying that the people that are typically victims are not the government nor the police, but they are immigrants, they're Muslims, they're LGBT persons, they're Black, Indigenous, persons of color, they're left-leaning, political persons. So, the true threat is to those persons, not so much as the police, but want to make sure, how familiar are you with this group and their ideology?
Ryan, I'm glad you actually sent me this question ahead of time, because I had never heard of them before. So I Googled what 3%ers were, because I've never heard of them, which means that clearly I didn't know about this rally that they had last weekend, because I've never heard of this group. I don't know where they're affiliated in our city. But I'll answer your question as this. Again, like we said to Amanda at her previous question, we're not going to tolerate, obviously, any behavior that is against the law, whether that be racially biased, a hate crime, anything like that. If these folks have weapons that are, assaulting others or threatening to assault others or threatening to assault us, we're going to treat them the same way that we would treat anybody else in that type of situation. So, again, I was shocked that I hadn't heard of this group before. I'm not sure why that is, other than the simple fact that I just haven't. And Brian and I touched base a little bit about this, and he said the same thing, which means clearly it hasn't risen to our level yet, right, to where they've caused any issues, at least that we know of. But I'm glad you let us know about it.
Yeah, and it's a great point. Is there are evolutions of this group across the country, and we've not seen much of it in Minnesota. And that's because in Minnesota, we do have very entrenched biker gangs that affiliate with white supremacy, that are on your law enforcement gang lists. So I think that the 3%ers are a newer evolution of that. I think it's a way to gain new members towards this supremacy tactic. Meanwhile, separating from the known criminal activity of those other gangs. So I'd love to just get you guys more information from what we know, through media, and then through also a lot of researching this to ensure that we can identify this type of insignia, because they know what their insignia is. They know how to identify one another. And in the Crystal case, it's buried underneath what appears to be, a patriotic appeal. So, it's a very small percent of this patriotic symbolism. And while hopefully they're not pursuing white supremacy in our community, because there is a different, we sort of talk about decentralized, organizations, there is a different belief here, potentially that they believe in the original, which is still debatable on whether there's fact behind their revolutionary roots, but it's more about what are they really trying to do. There's always what they want us to think they're doing, but then there's the other side of, what are they truly trying to accomplish through their organizing. So, glad to hear that you're doing your homework, and that at least now you're aware. Again, this is a newer revolution. One of our city council members actually liked their post on Facebook, and was also unaware of the potential connections and then the known connections of 3%ers and their insignia across the country. So we'll continue that discussion too, and share with you what we know, so that your officers can be aware that if there's an incident and there's a Black, Indigenous, or person of color that's been attacked, and they find this insignia that they have a visual identifier of, okay, I really need to know that there's a racial aspect to this crime or this behavior. And I think that's really our concern, is just making sure you guys are aware, so that because that's the stuff that gets missed sometimes.
And intentionally so. I mean, it's designed to be missed in a lot of cases, so it's certainly worth discussing. I want to jump in just because we're a little over half time right now, and we've still got several questions to go. And people
Amanda,
time.
Yes. Can I interrupt you just for a second and say,
please, yes, please.
To both of your points, one of the things gangs are obviously not new. Gangs have been around for a long, long time here in our society. And one of the things that we know over years is that they are constantly morphing. And insignia and symbolism and all of that, and what they stand for even. I mean, that stuff is always moving. And so just to your point, Ryan, I would just make sure that anybody knows, we try to stay on top of that. We try to, make sure that officers know, hey, if you see this, it may be an affiliation with this, or it may just be an unknowing teen who just thought it was cool, but we want to know that. And so anytime people hear stuff like that is going on, that is concerning of groups, well, that's stuff that we want to hear, because we want to stay on top of it so that we know what's happening, because as much as we can try, the world's moving faster than we are. So I just wanted to point out that, I mean, this is great that this was brought up, but I know there are others. There are more out there that we just haven't heard about yet. And so anytime they come up, certainly I would encourage folks to let us know.
Really quickly, for the people who are tuned in right now, we've talked a couple times about, reach out to you, whether it's to give a tip of something that's not an immediate emergency that's happening, or if there's just questions and concerns that a community member has. Where's the best place to reach out with that?
So I would say, I think it depends, Amanda. Obviously, Brian and I will take any phone calls or emails at any time. So please know that. If people don't feel comfortable actually talking to a police officer or to Brian and I, we do have what's called a tip line, where they can be anonymous and give us information on that tip line. And that tip line number is 763-531-1020. Brian? Yep, Brian's saying yes. I did that right, 1020. So if people feel more comfortable doing it that way, they certainly can. But again, reaching out to Brian or I, we're more than happy to help and answer any questions.
And the piggyback to that would be as well that as kind of part of the origin of this, and Ryan, your opening comments, some people are not going to be comfortable having a discussion with us because of their past experience with this uniform. It doesn't matter what I say. Well, then I go find the end run around to do that. So within your group, the two of you, I mean, reach out to someone, because I don't really care how the information gets to me. I care that I get the information. So Ryan, if you call me and say, hey, a friend of a friend of a friend had this experience, well, now I have something to go with, as opposed to nobody says anything and now we don't know that something's happening, or that maybe there's something we need to look into more. So if someone doesn't feel comfortable contacting us direct, certainly I would hope there's enough of you out there who have had experiences that people could go to as the conduit, if you will.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a question from the comments, Ryan, as long as that sounds good to you.
Yeah.
Because I think it kind of piggybacks fairly well off of this one. We've got a Facebook user who's watching right now who says, it's clear to me that the police are overburdened in what they are tasked to do in our community, particularly when it comes to people with mental health needs. Adding a part-time person, mental health person, is a great first step. So a staff member whose focus is to focus on community mental health. If funding and staffing were no issue, what would you like to see mental health and policing look like in Crystal?
It's a great question. And, I'll tell you, just in case some of those who are watching don't know. So as this person is questioning about the part-time mental health person, so we're going to be partnering with the cities of New Hope and Robbinsdale to hopefully here come January add a Hennepin County social worker embedded in all three of our police departments to deal with our mental health calls for service. Because as all of you know, mental health, it's not like it's new. It's just been folks have just been overburdened with everything going on in the world, and our mental health crisis is here. And we have many calls for service in the city of Crystal related to mental health. And so if money were no object, right? And unfortunately money is an object, but if I had someone tell me tomorrow that you're going to give me $10 million to spend on the police department and what it would be, it would definitely be for mental health resources, because I can't tell you how many times a day that our officers are being tasked with dealing with folks who are unfortunately suicidal, or unfortunately just don't know what to do with their certain situation at any given time that they're having this crisis. Now, I will tell you this, obviously, you know, some of our mental health calls that we do respond to can turn into, unfortunately, a violent situation, meaning there could be guns in the homes. And so I would hate to have a social worker be in that position. But with that said, we need to team with social workers trained when it comes to mental health aspects. I'm fortunate to say that our officers have been trained in many mental health related trainings, but we're not mental health experts. Keep that in mind. You know, we are trained in so many various different things because we do wear so many hats. I pride my team on the fact that I think they're the best resources when it comes to dealing with our community and our population when it comes to mental health calls. However, it doesn't mean that we're going to be the best person there at the time dealing with it, right? We could be possibly, but then maybe not either, right? Because maybe they don't respond to the uniform, as Brian said, right? Maybe they respond to someone else. But if I had $10 million, we would definitely have a different, we'd still have law enforcement officers, but we'd also have many mental health professionals embedded with us.
Mhm. Ryan, I think you're muted.
We can't hear you, right?
You muted yourself. You're being so polite.
I muted myself. I did it myself. So on that note, you know, when does the New Hope Crystal Robbinsdale partnership for a mental health social worker begin?
Yeah, great question. So I'm hoping that the council approves our budget here December, which it looks like they're going to, as they have already approved the preliminary levy, and which means things take a little bit of time, right? It's so I'm hoping in January then to be able to connect with Robbinsdale and New Hope again and Hennepin County, and hopefully get somebody in our department between, I would say, probably April, hopefully no later than April of next year.
That's
And just
excellent. How can community members support that?
Just a clarification I would give, and I'm not sure that you said this, Chief, I'm sorry if it's repetitive, but when we talk about embedded social worker, that's kind of one of those buzz phrases that's out there that you hear a bunch. Certainly to start, this person is not going to be riding around in a squad car. Their job is, as we get calls to residents that we're dealing with regularly, that they are on the back end going to help us resource getting that person what they need, because there's not enough mental health resource out there and it's hard to access. And so we're hoping that that person serves as the pipeline. But again, you hear embedded social worker, people think they come with the cape walking into the volatile scene. The officers are still going to respond. These folks are going to help us so that we don't have continual calls, hopefully, with that same individual.
Great.
And that hiring process, is that is there any civilians that have, you know, a contribution to the job description or that hiring process?
So it's actually not us as the police department doing the hiring, it's Hennepin County, because they're
Okay.
the ones that are actually the mental health social workers' bosses. So we're just sharing them, right? So they're just going to be housed in our buildings, but they actually report to Hennepin County.
So similar to the JCPP relationship.
Exactly.
Okay. Excellent. So
Ryan, I know it's going to be your turn to ask a question, but do you think we should ask again, it flows so well. You guys, all you listeners asked such great questions that tie into each other so well. I kind of would like to ask the question regarding how many psychological screenings officers need to take before being hired. For example, Minneapolis went from 5 to 1. And there's obviously some public trust issues and a significant amount of troubled officers. This is, again, user submitted. When hiring Crystal's officers, what are the current pre-employment psychiatric standards? Have the requirements changed in the past 10 years regarding this? If so, how? What scorecard, if any, is being used to ensure there is not a bias by evaluators? And are you, this I'm not familiar with, are you familiar with the psychology process called ego strength? That I've not heard of that, but that seems to piggyback really well.
I can expound
Sorry,
on that.
Ryan.
Yep, it's perfect.
So I'll try not to be too long-winded about this, but I want to talk about just in general the hiring of a police officer, and just so you can get those facts first, right? So when someone decides that they want to become a law enforcement officer in the state of Minnesota, you have to have at least a 2-year college education, and we're one of very few states in the union that has that. So besides the 2-year education, they also have to go through what's called the skills program, or i.e. the police academy, which is the hands-on learning portion of what it is to be a police officer. After that, and after they obtain that degree, and after they obtain the police academy, they then have to take what's called the post test. And we've talked about this before, what post is. Peace Officer Standards and Training. We're licensed in the state of Minnesota, just like attorneys are or nurses are. They pass that post test, and then they now can become eligible to be a police officer. So someone goes to our city of Crystal, decides they want to be a police officer here. We are in a hiring process. So the steps are like this. We do what we call the first step is, we call it speed date. I hate to say speed dating. It's not speed dating, but it's like speed dating, because we want to see every single applicant imaginable who apply with us. So if it's 100 people, we want to see all 100 people. And so they go through a 2 to 5 minute quick interview screening process. And then from there, it gets whittled down to another more formal interview process. And then the third interview is actually with myself, the deputy chief, and the assistant city manager. And then from there, they go to the background phase. The background phase is what takes the longest, because we take a deep dive into that person's history from the time they were born. And people laugh at that, but it's true. We literally get every single place of employment that they've ever had, every single place that they've lived in their entire lifetime. It's a very extensive process that takes at least 30 to 45 days of backgrounding. From there, if they pass that background, then they actually go on to what is called the medical screening, which they go before a doctor. The doc checks to make sure that they can bend, that they can use their body okay for this job, make sure they're, in proper shape to be a police officer. Then they do the drug screening, making sure that they are not on any narcotics, obviously, or ever have been. And then they do the physical agility test, which is the running and the jumping and the, all of that fun stuff that we have to do in our job. And then the psychological screening. They go before a psychologist, where they take, it's about a 6-hour process where they take a series of a battery of different kind of testing. So the MMPI, the California testing. They also take reason testings, not English, but basically vocabulary testing. Some math is in there, which I've always found interesting, because my God, if I had to do that again, I'd be in trouble. And then some other written testing that they do, and then they sit down with the psychologist for about an hour and a half to 2 hours, going over their life history. And it's amazing to me, these psychologists really know what they're doing, and I don't know how they do it, but they sure know within that hour to 2 hour, and then all the testing they do, it's spot on what this person, their strengths are, the things they need to improve on. So that's the first step, right? They get hired as a police officer, and if they passed everything up until the shrink test, then we can hire them, right?
Okay. And again, this is true for the state of Minnesota?
Correct. The entire state of Minnesota, all police officers in this state. And so from there, this is where it gets tricky. Your question about, well, how many times, right? So I'll be honest, I have been tested 7 different times for before a psychologist. And the reason for that is, here in Crystal, we make it a point to make sure that we actually give a psychological screening to anyone who gets promoted to any rank. Okay, so I started here as a CSO. I got tested there, right, for my psych. When I got hired as a police officer, got tested for that. As a sergeant, I got tested at the psychologist for that. As the neighborhood policing community engagement sergeant, I got tested for that. As deputy chief, and then as chief, so it's 6 times, not 7, 6. So that is how, at least in Crystal, that's how we do it. I don't know how they do it in other agencies, but that's how we do it here.
Do you happen to know if that's the standard in Minneapolis or if there's anything?
I have no idea. Sorry.
We won't be able to expound on what other jurisdictions do or don't do. But
Yes. The post board does require departments to do a psychological screen, but I'm pretty sure that it does not prescribe what that means. So I think my sense is there's a lot of latitude there in what they could do with that.
Sure. Okay.
So my question on that is, what is the relationship to that evaluator, that psychologist? Is it someone you guys know? Are they certified at the city, or what is the relationship?
Yeah, so we have a I don't want to even call it a contract, because it's not a contract with this. I mean, we just happen to use this particular psychology group that has much experience. And we've been with them for quite a while. Obviously, if things were to change and our relationship change, we don't need to use them anymore. We decide to use someone else, we certainly can do that. In fact, I just got a phone call from one of them today because we're in the process of hiring a CSO. And so we have a good working relationship, but I'll tell you this, they are not afraid. We recently here had them tell us that, no, there's no way I'm not going to be recommending this person to hire. And so they're very honest to tell us that, and we don't hire people that they don't recommend.
That's good to hear. The only thing to just leverage in this conversation is that to consider how they assess officers of color and women compared to how they assess male officers. So that's the only thing I just want to put into your consciousness is to consider that as you're getting those evaluations. And I hope that obviously in your role you have that consciousness and thought, but just the community sees that and considers that. And there's a wonderfully written article by a physician on this topic, and I'll send you a link after this. I sent it out to the group in the chat, but this physician talks about ego strength. And ego strength is the ability to tolerate frustration and stress and postpone gratification, modify selfish desires when necessary, and resolve internal conflicts and emotional problems before they lead to a neurosis. So he advocates that strengthening the ego is a fundamental goal of psychoanalysis, which typically involves hour-long sessions. And so something else to consider that in this is not necessarily the psychoanalysis, but a form of continuing education that can help officers strengthen their ego strength, so that when they are met with adversity and confrontation, that they have the mental wherewithal to handle that. Obviously, mental health is a focus of policing, and in your administration role, you're focusing on that. But I think that there's some great information here on not necessarily just weeding out candidates, but also how to improve officer mental health, because that's going to what impacts us in the end as community members, is a mentally fit officer. So
two things I would say to that quick, Ryan. One of them is that we get a pretty detailed report back. We get a phone consult with the psychologist who did the work, but then we get a pretty detailed report back. And I, like the chief, I think I've done 6 of them. And it's interesting to me when you read it, just like when you take Myers-Briggs or when you do any of them, that you go, wow, how did that? I mean, that's pretty accurate. But one of the things we do with that is that written assessment we give to the candidate, and we talk through it. Typically, prior to hiring them, I have a discussion with them to say, hey, here's what this is. Is it a fair appraisal? And a lot, and it's everything. It's not just the report is not just they're psychologically fit. They don't have severe mental illness. I mean, that certainly is part of what they're appraising, but really what they're appraising is tendencies. Where are they going to struggle? What's going to be a strength for them? How are they going to be to manage? How are they going to do independently? Can they make decisions? It's all that stuff. And so it is certainly broader than just a psychological screen, but then we do try to use that to say, hey, we've identified this now, so let's make sure as we're managing through this new stressful career that we are building on your strengths and dealing with the things that might be a concern. And then the second thing I would just mention, because I think it certainly fits, is we are just launching into a contract with a licensed therapist whose background is in first responders, law enforcement, more specific, and trauma. And one of the things that we are starting is that our expectation is that all of our staff, not just our officers, all of our staff have a mandatory session with that therapist once a year. We don't dictate what happens in that. We don't get a report of what happens in that. It's HIPAA protected. What their requirement is that they have to attend that session. And then we also have given that provider the latitude to go. She meets with me, and between she and I, we realize, yeah, you got the weight of some stuff on you here. One's not enough. And we've said, you just give us a bill for how many sessions you do, and we're gonna take care of your needs, with that idea of years and years of seeing stuff that people aren't supposed to see. You may have been very psychologically sound before. Fast forward 8, 9, 10 years to a lot of traumatic events. We want to continue to make sure we're sticking with that and investing in it. So I just think that fits in with this conversation, that we want to do more than just hire someone and know that they're psychologically fit. We really want to continue that on to them through the career, to your point, Ryan, so that what you're dealing with when you call 911 for whatever is someone who is remaining stable, not just because they were stable 10 years ago when they started.
Mhm.
Would you say that, I think that's really excellent. I was just going to ask, when you answered before I had a chance, is it encouraged and is it accessible for officers to, should they choose to, should it be recommended, continue to meet with the therapist? And so I guess my question is, there's a lot of just general stigma around mental illness therapy, and mental illness even is a loaded term, especially when you're talking about people who walk around with guns in a holster. So it's scary to consider that really all of us are humans walking around with baggage and trauma and a breadth of experiences that can really affect how we handle any given situation. So without, and I want to say this for the benefit of the audience to remember that cops are humans too. And so attending therapy sessions does not necessarily, and I'm going to go ahead and go on record and say I do it. Attending therapy sessions is not a marker of being mentally unsound, mentally unfit. It can also be a marker of someone who takes their mental health very seriously. So with that in mind, would you say that the culture in the CPD is one that embraces that opportunity? Not just from the top down, but also what do you see in the ranks? Do you see people using that option? Or do you see them using it reluctantly? What do you feel like is working well with that? And where do you think you can improve in that area?
So I'll answer, maybe Chief, if you got something to add, but this initiative of these mandatory check-ins, we're just starting. That said, we just kind of announced it to the team here a couple weeks ago. And frankly, because we're officers and we're guarded and, there's a work life and there's a home life and we kind of want to separate them, I didn't know what the response would be. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. I haven't heard anybody concerned about it. Partly, we've tried to ensure that we make it as safe as we can for them. I don't know what you talked with them about. I don't know what happened. I just want to know that you go and that you're taking care of yourself. And so I think the receptiveness, at least on the early end, has been good. I know that we have a number of officers who have sought therapy with different providers. And, I think there has been a long-term stigma in law enforcement about, hey, we're the helpers and we're fine, we got this. I think that stigma is going away. I certainly would like to think we're even beyond that, as we've even had officers who have done therapy in the past who have said, hey, this was really helpful for me. and I would encourage it. So, of course, there's going to be some, because there's going to be some in every group who I think are a little cautious in this, but I have been very pleased so far with the response that I've seen.
That's excellent to hear. Thank you. Thank you for letting us know that. Ryan, I
Yeah.
feel like I've asked the last few questions. You should go next.
If I could just quickly, I'll just be quick.
Oh,
you know,
sure.
I
Absolutely.
One of your YouTube users put up that, mental health is recognizing mental health is a strength, right? Not a weakness. Thank you. And that is so very true. And coming from a family where I have a parent who has had mental health struggles for years, and she is truly my hero because I know that she has dealt with so many things throughout her life that has had to strengthen her up as a human being. And not only that, but has shown me that as her daughter. So it's very important to Brian and I to make sure that our officers are mentally fit, not just because they need to show that to the community, but for themselves because we care about them.
Yeah, and I think an important distinction that you just kind of touched on there is your experience can make you either stronger or hardened depending on how it's dealt with. And I think that the key point here is that, to me, what I'm hearing is that the Crystal Police Department is making sure that those experiences that could either harden or strengthen you are being given ample opportunity and encouragement to actually strengthen by having that resource available. So I'm really heartened to hear that that's a resource that's being made available to the city's police officers.
I have said to our officers for a while, and certainly as we've rolled this out, that my goal is that you get through this safely, that you're not injured or killed in the line of duty. That's certainly a goal. But I also have a goal that you get through however long your career is, 20, 25, 30 years, and that we leave you the person that you were, that we don't leave you the shell of the person that you once were, and you've chewed up and spit out all of your relationships and all of your joy and whatever. We want you to leave like you should be able to leave when you retire, happy and sailing off into the sunset. And so that when we talk about safety and officer safety is something we talk about, we got to think about officer safety in its entirety.
Absolutely.
So someone just submitted a great question. I think that we've touched on this in prior sessions of our conversation, but I'll display this here for you. Well, it doesn't look like it's going to show it all, but the YouTube user says, do you hold each other accountable if need be?
Yeah, great question. I'm glad it was asked. So obviously, as the CLEO, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer, that's one of my primary jobs, right? That's in my job description, that I hold myself and all staff accountable, right? But I don't want it should not just be me, right? It's got to be the line officer that works on the street to the community service officer. And I feel that we have a great culture here of well-disciplined officers that do hold each other accountable. I've seen it in action myself when I've been out there witnessing events, and I do believe that we have that. And if we don't have that, then that's my job and Brian's job, right, to make sure that they are held accountable. And that's, unfortunately, sometimes that does happen, where it does come to Brian and I's level where we need to hold that person accountable, but thankfully we do not have that too often here.
Thanks for the response there. And kind of in that accountability realm of questions, is the question around, what is your officer's expected response to being filmed by third parties during an encounter? So in this, if you can answer what your officer's expected response should be, but then also maybe provide a recommendation for, say, if I'm witnessing something and I want to film it for accountability, but also to protect maybe someone I feel is, having a overuse of force or something, how can I do so legally, safely, and respectfully?
Yeah. So our officers are filmed all the time. I'd say on a day. I mean, Brian can chime in here, but on a daily basis, we're used to it. It's nothing that's surprising to us. It's been this way for, I'd say, the last 5-6 years or so. So our staff is used to it, and they're completely fine with it. all I ask and what they ask is that people do it safely, right? If we're involved, for example, when our officer was run over here not that long ago, there were, I would say, at least 30 people around that scene that were filming that incident. And as long as people are at a safe distance, right? That's our biggest concern, is that we don't want them to get hurt while they're doing this, right? Don't be standing in the middle of a roadway when there's cars flying by filming, right? Try to do it safely, do it up on the curb, do it, at least a good, amount of feet back so that they're at least safe. And that's something that I think would be helpful for the audience to know about that.
More to the point,
Excellent.
though, what is the, sorry, and I apologize if this is maybe not relevant, but in that question, I hear what's the expected response. So if you were to have an officer who, in all other situations, does everything that's expected of them and lives up to these standards that we've detailed about, being mentally sound, etc. And one day that officer gets into some kind of encounter in which they're being filmed and they react by insisting on stopping being filmed or trying to take the phone away. Any of these things that we've seen in the YouTube videos that pop up every once in a while, that can happen. That because again, humans and we're going to rep brain every once in a while, and it makes us make decisions. What is the expected response? Is that something that they're allowed to do, to say stop filming me?
No, not at all. And if that happens to someone, then they need to make sure that they tell their supervisor about it, right? And to discuss that so that we can look at the video together with that person and just figure out what's going on with that officer for that day, right? And figure out why he or she reacted the way they did.
Sure, thank you.
The additional caveat I would say to that, and the chief alluded to it, but just so it's clear, certainly there needs to be safety for them. I think there was some footage up in northern Minnesota here recently of an elected official who got it. Well, okay, you're now in the middle of the road, and now you've become part of my problem in this scene because I have to be responsible for what's happening. If we are in the middle of enforcement action, I would argue that we need, if the person filming is getting into that space, we don't know you or what your intent is, to the previous conversation about groups. So you film, but we would ask that you film from a safe distance so that the officers are not now also having to focus on you. One of the follow-up questions that sometimes comes of that is, and what if we're trying to film and what we're filming is that outrageous that we are that concerned? For instance, the George Floyd incident, to which my response would be that if it really is that much and that filming it is not enough, I'm going to encourage folks to call 911 and say, we need a supervisor here right now. And that will get communicated. The only other thing I'll say, and this is not my cop hat on, this is my human hat on. I really don't care who films what. Go ahead. As the chief said, we're used to it. I will say, just as a human being, it bums me out, some of the stuff that people film and post, that someone is in the worst moment of their lives. They're in a mental health crisis. They're in a bad car crash. They are severely injured, and people are there filming it and posting it. And I just think that's not where you want your loved ones to be. Again, that's not a law enforcement statement. I'm not going to stop you from doing it, but I think seeing it all the time as a human, I just go, yeah, we don't need to, for our own entertainment value, take great delight in enjoying the downfalls of other people's lives. So I just had to say it. Sorry.
Certainly. No, that's fair. I think that there's a delicate line that's walked in between filming and sharing for being, holding accountable law enforcement in a time when there is this breach of public trust that we're dealing with. And then also kind of forgive me, but a masturbatory view of voyeurship of chaos. I totally agree. It's difficult. And as a community, we need to hold each other accountable to paying attention to why we're filming and why we're posting, particularly when we also have communities of color coming out and saying, this is re-traumatizing. Mm-hmm. When we post these things and we have to watch these things over and over and over again, we're not helping anyone by doing this. So that's a wonderful call out, I think.
Yeah, and that's something I was just going to share too with the chief and deputy chief, is that's a conversation we've had in our group as well on not sharing graphic videos. So it's a great call out and an opportunity for us to discuss that here and remind the community. You used a trigger word to another question here, which is about supervisor. There's a situation actually that's happened in Crystal that's made me aware of this. Someone that's afraid to come forward to discuss it because she was arrested for what was deemed disorderly conduct because she was essentially got drug into a situation that she was observing. But a supervisor didn't get called to the scene, and this was years ago, so we're not going to over speculate on it. But more of a what is the standard now? What could it be in the future? So the question is, do you require supervisory approval before someone can be arrested for failure to comply, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, or disturbing the peace?
So the simple answer is no, but there's a caveat to that, right? So for example, right now, there's nowhere in our policy that says a supervisor must be on scene before an officer makes arrest. With that said though, every single report that an officer does has to be approved by a supervisor before it goes up the food chain, right? And before it goes out to the city attorney for charging. So it's a no to, but it's a yes to a supervisor is always looking at reports. Does that make sense?
It does.
It also, just so you know, because we're such a small community and have a short amount of staff, it's most likely that a supervisor is probably going to be on the scene anyway, but not all the time, right? It just depends. They could be dealing with something else on the northern part of our city where this incident happened on the south. But I would have to say more often than not, a supervisor is normally on the scene anyway.
Thank you for the feedback. And just to expound, I think some of the concern here is that obviously there's ego involved. And when someone gets a hurt ego, they want to defend and or to kibosh. So the idea being that by having a supervisor, someone with a more experience or more of a level set head or a uninvolved ego may be able to unwind one of those circumstances, given that it's a charge that can stick with someone for life from a situation that could have just been 7 minutes of a heated moment and an officer with an ego or someone to really just unpack that situation, because those four instances typically are really lesser offenses, but they can really create life-changing impacts. So just food for thought to consider.
And not just an officer with an ego, but also to just really quickly add to that, Ryan, I think it's important to point out that a lot of times we see it's not just an officer with an ego. It could also be, or separately, both and, a citizen who doesn't fully understand their rights in a situation like that and is fearful of losing them, and becomes, I guess this word sounds charged, but maybe combatant. Just and that feeling of resistance is merely out of a fear that their rights are being trampled on. So yeah, I just wanted to point out that I think it can be definitely both.
One of the things that we talk about sometimes in police training is, obstruction of justice is basically the term, the legal term that covers most of those things. And so obstruction of legal process, you first have to have a legal process that's happening, and then you have to be able to define how the person is obstructing that legal process. One of the things that I will, I do some teaching in the skills program, and so I'm teaching cops to be. One of the things I say to them is what the charge of what I call COC, which is contempt of cop, is not, that does not meet the threshold of obstruction. Just because someone's talked issue to you, said stuff about you and your family and your history, that they don't like you, that they disagree with what you're doing, all of that stuff, none of that stuff meets a legal threshold for obstruction. And that's contempt of cop. And I believe that contempt of cop is something that can be a cultural thing in departments. That we decided that we were frustrated, to your point, and we made the arrest, and then we backed our way into what the charge was that we're going to give them. And I certainly we are in charge situations, but certainly we talk to our cops about, we're not arresting people for contempt of cop. People get to say and do stuff to cops, and that's part of what you sign on to when you decide to put this uniform on.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really good clarifying response. We have gone about 75 minutes, and I think that there's just one question. If anyone has questions from Q&A from Facebook or YouTube, feel free to put that in. But one of the last questions we have is, what sort of diversity, equity, inclusion training are officers required to take, and what is your discrimination policy, or not your zero discrimination policy look like?
So most recently, we may have discussed this a little bit, maybe at the first meeting, about how law enforcement in the state of Minnesota must have 16 CEU credits, which has diversity training, implicit bias training, cultural competency, along with mental health training, critical incident training. So that's something that's mandatory that all law enforcement officers in the state of Minnesota must have. So many of our officers have been through a 40-hour course throughout their, the last few years here, but also on a regular basis, we take what's called a Patrol Online course, where we can go right online, where we can have this 1-hour session that tells us regarding various different things, not just about diversity and implicit bias. So do I think we can do a better job? I do. Absolutely, I do. And that's something that Brian and I, are doing research on. But I am glad to say that our officers are trained in this training. When you ask about your second question about, tell me what the second question, part of your question was again.
So asking about your policy towards discrimination.
Yep. So the post board, the Peace Officer Standards and Training Board, has a mandatory policy for all state law enforcement agencies to have a policy on discrimination. It's not called discrimination. It's bigger, some different wording, but it basically is about discrimination policy. So that's something that has been in our policy for decades, and it should be, and because it's something that we don't tolerate here, and shouldn't. And one of the things that is important to know for everyone listening is that we take this very seriously, and not just because of what we're seeing today in law enforcement and what's going on in the world, but this department is known to have a great culture of officers who want before me was chief, this culture that we've had in Crystal has always been community focused and community based. I'm not saying that we don't do it wrong sometimes, right? And then that's when we hold our officers accountable, because we have made missteps and have had to, unfortunately, deal with that. But with that said, I'm proud to say that that's something that is embedded in this organization culturally, to make sure that we treat everybody with compassion and professionalism. We're dedicated to that.
You just said that something that ties right in with what we just got from a user, it being embedded in the culture. So do you perceive that Crystal officers take the training seriously, or do they view it as a hoop they have to jump through, a box to check? Is empathy training part of any of the current training?
I'm glad this person asked this. It's something that Brian and I talked about regularly also. Brian is he's our training coordinator, and the one thing he makes sure of when he was hired here was saying to me, he doesn't want the box checked, right? Just because we're mandated to take these courses doesn't mean it should be a box check, because we all know what happens, right? You check the box, you're not going to pay attention to it. It's the same thing with, right, if you're going to force me to go to some DWI school that I'm not interested in, I am not going to sit there and listen to it for 8 hours, right? I'm going to check out and not be interested. So no, I would say that we are thankful that our officers know this isn't a check the box training. This is something that is very important to us. It's very important from me all the way down to the bottom, to the CSO and to our reserves and explorers, to understand that our culture is making sure that we're here to serve every single person in this community.
I think two things I would add to that would be, Ryan, at I think the last time we were together, you had talked about the Center for Policing Equity, and which is an organization I had not heard of, and so I've looked into that as a potential resource. We're open to resources, not unlike the previous conversation. There's stuff popping up all over, and what we find in times like this, to be very candid, is you find lots of opportunists. So the number of training announcements I've gotten for bias training, for equity training, for whatever, I get a ton of them. And at a time like this, I'm always a little skeptic, because I go, yeah, you see the dollar sign. You're in this because you saw a niche and you're gonna go for the niche. I'm looking for the established. I'm looking for an organization that's been around and has been doing this work and didn't just pop up because you saw a way to get a buck. So I say that just to simply say, certainly, as this group, grows, or other folks, if people know of people who do good training in this particular area or other areas, I would welcome being able to look into those resources so that we can give robust stuff. Partly, I think when you look at, as you all know, when you look at bias training, we're all at a different spot, in my opinion, on that pendulum of where we are in terms of our understanding of our own bias and how we're addressing it, et cetera. And so, again, for me, it's not about checking the box. It's about how do we most effectively take Brian Hubbard, figure out where Brian's at, and move farther down the path. So that's one thought, is, again, I'll take those resources. And the second one is, my hope would be, to the answer, do they take it serious? I think that has to be reflective in what's the day-to-day interaction that they have. I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road. You can go to a training and you learn something or you learn nothing, but when you go to do your job, are you actually doing your job the way people want it to be done? And I think, to the chief's point, I'd like to think we have a culture here where the overwhelming majority of people say we are treated with empathy, we are treated respectfully, we are treated with a sense of neutrality, if you will. Does that happen all the time? Of course not. Of course it doesn't, because we have that human piece. But that's where I think people show up to training. I think they take it seriously, but I don't care if they take it seriously. What I care is, did you learn something, and are you better for it, and how you're doing your job and interacting with the people that you interact with? That's how we find out if you're taking it serious, I guess.
That's the measure. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Amanda, did you have any last questions?
Can we do this again sometime? This has been fun.
There is one other question there, which is a really quick one that I noticed off to the side here. Is someone simply speaking, like asking why, or trying to tell their side considered resisting arrest to you? And my statement would be no, and I would be pretty frustrated to hear any of our officers that would even hint at otherwise.
Yeah.
Again, that threshold for resistance, for that obstruction, is a pretty big one, and you asking questions or giving your opinion even robustly that would not be considered resisting anything. So
thank you. And the reason I hadn't put that forth is mostly, and thank you for addressing it. The user, I'm sure, is particularly happy that you did. I kind of felt like it fell under that contempt of cop that you highlighted, which I think is a really succinct way of putting that. I think that's great, and thank you for expounding on that.
Yeah, I couldn't understand the question personally, so I'm glad you were able to
Too much
use your
going on.
lens. It's just a lens. I don't personally have that lens. So that's where I think us having these conversations, we get to bring our lens to it. You get to bring yours, and we get to hopefully leave with a little closer to 2020 vision than we arrived with. So
2020 vision. Oh my God.
yeah, we better get to 2021 quick. So let's disregard the 2020. Too much pun there. But again, thank you both for the opportunity for this candid discussion. And again, unscripted access and opportunity between community and police. I hope that those that are able to tune in get to feel a lot more trust. But again, I just want to reiterate that the Crystal Police Department has exemplified an open door policy to us, this group, and to you if you're hearing this. So if you have a concern, bring it forth. If you're not being heard, Crystal Residents for Change is listening. So between Crystal Police and Crystal Residents for Change, like, we will help anything that is happening in this community. We're here for all of our residents, and particularly those that have felt as though their lives have mattered less. So again, to our Black, Indigenous, persons of colors in our community, we love you, we respect you, your life matters, and please speak up and be heard.
And Ryan, I'll email you with a date in October that works for all of us, and we can do this again. And it doesn't
Excellent.
have to be. Please don't wait, though. Obviously, if we pick a date sometime in October and something comes up before that, like I've always said, don't hesitate to reach out.
Excellent. Yeah, and we can
So much.
we can talk after this and see what worked. We'll talk to the group too and see what they're looking for as far as the next round of conversation. And I think that this technology aspect, we worked out a couple kinks, and I think it's really working to provide a microphone to our conversations and transparency as well. So thank you both again.
Barring
And I know Anne
thunderstorms,
had
I think we've got it under control.
yeah, that too. So I know Anne had to head out, but I thank her as well for being on early on to help explain what a charter-based city is. I will add some kind of time clips to this video and comments and on the YouTube channel, so people can see the question and then locate the answer to those questions as well, for those that maybe just want to tune into a couple of things, because obviously this 90-minute conversation went fast and we have a lot of great detail, but realistically not everyone will likely be chiming in to watch 90 minutes.
Sounds great. Thank you both. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all. Have a
a
good night.
wonderful night.